Every parent knows the weight of watching your child's dreams slip away because you can't afford to keep them alive. Tom Mitchell had buried his wife and was about to lose everything else: his home, his savings, his ability to give his 10-year-old son Ben the life he deserved. They moved into Tom's father's old cabin in the woods, where Tom took odd jobs and Ben found adventure in the wilderness around their new home. One morning, while clearing brush, they found something buried behind the old root cellar, a moss-covered container hidden for decades. Inside were wooden crates filled with handcrafted toys, mechanical inventions, and journals from someone who had vanished during the Great Depression. When they took one piece to town, a museum curator recognized it as the work of a legendary lost artisan. The contents weren't just rare, they were worth $4 million. But who was this mysterious craftsman, and why had he hidden his treasures in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of ancient oaks as Tom Mitchell stood on the sagging porch of his father's cabin, watching his son Ben disappear into the woods with the boundless energy that only 10-year-old boys possess. 6 months had passed since they'd moved here. 6 months since the hospital bills had finally consumed everything they'd worked for. 6 months since Tom had admitted to himself that starting over meant going backward, all the way back to the place where his own childhood had unfolded among these same towering trees. The cabin hadn't aged gracefully. Paint peeled from its weathered siding like old skin, and the roof bore patches that testified to decades of makeshift repairs. But it was theirs now, or would be once Tom figured out how to pay the back taxes his father had left behind. The Sioux old man had been stubborn about accepting help, even as the world moved on without him. And now Tom understood that stubbornness in ways he wished he didn't. Inside, cardboard boxes still lined the walls of what had once been his childhood bedroom, filled with the remnants of the life he and Emma had built together. Her medical textbooks, still bookmarked with sticky notes in her careful handwriting, Ben's artwork from better days, when their biggest worry was whether he'd remember to bring his lunch money to school, a wedding photo where they both looked impossibly young and certain that love would be enough to weather any storm. Tom poured himself coffee from a pot that had seen better decades and settled into his father's old chair by the window. The job market in Millbrook had proved as thin as he'd expected. A town of barely 3,000 people didn't offer much opportunity for a man whose experience was in suburban office work. But he'd found enough odd jobs to keep them fed. Handyman. Work mostly, drawing on skills his father had taught him during long summer visits that had seemed like punishment then, but felt like salvation now. Ben had adapted better than Tom had dared to hope. The boy had always been curious, always drawn to adventure, but Emma's illness had made him cautious, watchful. Here in the woods, away from the constant reminder of hospitals and treatments that hadn't worked, Ben had begun to reclaim some of the childhood that cancer had stolen from their family. He spent hours exploring, coming home with pockets full of interesting rocks and tales of secret paths that only he knew how to find. The woods held stories, Ben insisted. Every fallen log was a dragon's spine. Every cluster of unusual stones marked the site of an ancient battle. Tom had worried at first about letting the boy wander so freely, but Millbrook was the kind of place where children still rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where neighbors knew each other's names and kept an eye on things. Besides, Ben never strayed far, and he always returned by the time Tom called for dinner. This morning was different, though. Tom had woken to find Ben already dressed and eager to start some mysterious project he'd been planning for days. "We need to clear that brush behind the root cellar," Ben had announced over breakfast, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "There's something back there, Dad. I can feel it." Tom had learned to pay attention when Ben got that particular tone in his voice, the same quiet certainty Emma used to have when she diagnosed a patient before all the tests came back. So after his morning coffee and a check of the job listings that never seemed to have anything new, Tom had gathered tools and followed his son into the woods. The root cellar had been built by Tom's grandfather, a stone-lined pit covered with heavy wooden doors that had kept vegetables fresh through long winters when the nearest grocery store was 40 miles away. Over the years, nature had reclaimed the area around it, vines thick as Tom's wrist wrapped around oak saplings that had grown up through what might once have been a garden. Brambles formed an almost impenetrable wall, and decades of fallen leaves had created a soft, rotting carpet that gave way beneath their feet. "Right there," Ben said, pointing to a spot where the undergrowth seemed particularly dense. "See how those vines are growing? They're not random. They're growing around something." Tom followed his son's gaze and had to admit the boy was right. The vegetation formed an almost perfect circle, as if something beneath the surface was directing its growth. Together they began to cut away the brambles, working slowly to avoid the thorns that seemed determined to draw blood from anyone who disturbed their territory. An hour into their work, Tom's shovel struck something that wasn't earth or stone, something metal with the hollow ring of a container. He looked at Ben, whose eyes had gone wide with the kind of excitement that made Tom's chest tight with memory. Emma had looked just like that when she'd discovered she was pregnant, when all the world's possibilities had seemed to stretch out before them like an uncharted map. They cleared away more earth and vegetation, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a military surplus box, the kind used to store ammunition during the war. But this one had been modified, wrapped in a kind of waterproof material, and carefully sealed. Rust had claimed parts of it, but the container appeared sound, as if whoever had buried it had taken great care to protect its contents from the passage of time. "Should we open it?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom hesitated. There was something almost sacred about this moment, this discovery that felt like a gift from the earth itself. But Ben was already working at the latches, his small fingers more nimble than Tom's weathered hands, and together they managed to break the seal that had held for decades. The lid opened with a soft sigh, releasing air that smelled of cedar and old paper and something else, something like the inside of his grandfather's workshop, where time had moved slowly and every project had been approached with the patience of a man who believed in doing things right. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be custom-fitted compartments lined with oiled cloth, were wooden crates of various sizes. Each was wrapped carefully, almost reverently, and sealed with wax that had somehow maintained its integrity despite the years. Tom lifted out the smallest crate, feeling the weight of solid wood and whatever treasures it might contain. When he unwrapped it, both he and Ben gasped. Inside was a mechanical bird, no bigger than Tom's fist, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of wood, so fine-grained and perfectly finished that it seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight. Every feather was individually detailed, every tiny gear and spring visible through transparent panels in the bird's chest and wings. But this wasn't just a carving, it was a machine, intricate beyond anything Tom had ever seen. Ben reached out with one finger to touch a small lever near the bird's tail. Immediately the creature came to life. Its wings began to move in perfect rhythm. Its head turned from side to side, and from somewhere deep within its wooden chest came a song so pure and complex that it seemed impossible such a small device could produce it. The song lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but in that time both father and son were transported. The melody was haunting and joyful at once, speaking of things that couldn't quite be put into words, longing and hope and the kind of love that endures beyond loss. When it finished, the birds settled back into stillness, but something in the air around them had changed forever. Tom carefully set the bird on the ground between them and reached for another crate. This one contained what appeared to be a puzzle box, its surfaces covered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as the light moved across them. Another held a set of wooden figures that, when arranged in a certain way, began to move in an elaborate dance, each figure perfectly synchronized with the others. But it was the journals that truly captured their attention. 3 leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with diagrams and notes written in a careful hand. The technical drawings were incredibly detailed, showing the internal mechanisms of devices that seemed to blend art and engineering in ways that shouldn't have been possible. But it was the personal notes scattered throughout that made Tom's breath catch. "My dear boy," one entry began, dated sometime in the autumn of 1933. "I fear I will not be able to finish all the things I had hoped to create for you. But perhaps someday someone will find these pieces and understand what I was trying to say. Every gear, every spring, every carefully shaped piece of wood carries a message. I hope that message will be love." The entries went on, sometimes technical, sometimes deeply personal, but always written with the assumption that someone, someday, would find them and understand their significance. The unnamed author wrote about his work as if it were a conversation with the future, a reaching across time to touch hearts and minds he would never meet. As the afternoon wore on, Tom and Ben continued to explore the contents of the buried container. Each item they unwrapped seemed more remarkable than the last. A wooden clock that chimed with the voices of different birds, each hour bringing a new song. A mechanical theater with tiny figures that acted out scenes from fairy tales when properly wound. A chess set where the pieces moved themselves when placed on the board, as if eager to begin a game with an invisible opponent. By evening, they had barely scratched the surface of what the container held, but they knew they had found something extraordinary. More than extraordinary. They had found a piece of art and craftsmanship that belonged in a museum, created by someone whose skill and imagination defied explanation. That night, after Ben had gone to bed with the mechanical bird carefully placed on his nightstand where he could watch its intricate gears catch the moonlight, Tom sat at his father's old desk and tried to make sense of what they had discovered. The journals provided some clues, references to techniques used by master craftsmen of the early 20th century, mentions of tools and materials that were no longer commonly available. But the identity of the creator remained a mystery, hidden behind initials and coded references that meant nothing to Tom. What he did understand was that they had found something valuable, not just monetarily, though the craftsmanship alone suggested these pieces might be worth more than Tom dared to hope, but valuable in the way that great art is valuable, as a testament to human creativity and the desire to leave something beautiful behind. He thought about Emma, about the dreams they had shared, and the future that had been cut short. She would have loved this mystery, would have thrown herself into researching the creator's identity with the same passionate curiosity she had brought to everything in her life. For the first time since her death, Tom felt her absence not as a crushing weight, but as a gentle presence, as if she were encouraging him to follow this path wherever it might lead. Tomorrow, he decided, they would take one of the pieces to town. Someone there might know something about its origins, might be able to help them understand what they had found. But tonight, he was content to sit in the quiet cabin and listen to Ben's peaceful breathing from the next room, knowing that their lives had just taken a turn towards something he couldn't yet name, but was beginning to believe might be called hope. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. Tom had slept better than he had in months, and Ben was awake before dawn, carefully wrapping the mechanical songbird in one of Emma's old scarves before placing it in a wooden box Tom had found in his father's workshop. "We should take the journal, too," Ben said as they prepared for the drive into town. "Whoever made this bird, they wanted people to understand their work." Tom nodded, tucking one of the leather volumes under his arm. The pages he'd read by lamplight had revealed glimpses of a brilliant mind at work, technical notes, interspersed with philosophical musings about the nature of creation and the responsibility of the craftsman to his art. The author's identity remained hidden behind careful initials, but his passion for his work came through in every carefully penned line. Millbrook's main street looked much as it had during Tom's childhood visits, a collection of brick buildings that had witnessed the town's rise and gradual decline as larger cities drew away its young people and economic opportunities. But there was still life here, still a sense of community that Tom had forgotten existed in the digital age of suburban isolation. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its wraparound porch lined with rocking chairs that suggested a more leisurely approach to life than Tom had known in years. Inside, the rooms were filled with displays showcasing the town's history, logging exhibits, Native American artifacts, and photographs of families who had called this place home for generations. Tom and Ben found themselves directed to a back room where a woman in her 60s was carefully cataloguing what appeared to be a collection of antique kitchen implements. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes immediately focusing on the box in Tom's hands. "You must be the Mitchells," she said, rising from her work. "I'm Martha Henley. Word travels fast in a small town, and I heard you'd moved into the old Mitchell place. I knew your father, good man, kept to himself mostly, but always willing to lend a hand when needed." Tom introduced himself and Ben, then hesitated. "How did you explain that you'd found a buried treasure in your backyard?" "Without sounding like you'd lost your mind. Mrs. Henley," he began carefully, "we found something on the property yesterday. Something old and well-made, and we're hoping someone might be able to tell us about its origins." Martha's eyebrows rose with interest. "May I see it?" Ben stepped forward and carefully unwrapped the mechanical bird, placing it on Martha's work table. Even in the fluorescent light of the Historical Society's back room, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Martha bent over it, her practiced eye taking in details that Tom might have missed. "Good heavens," she whispered. "May I?" At Tom's nod, she gently activated the bird's mechanism. The song that emerged was every bit as haunting as it had been in the woods, but here, in this room filled with the accumulated history of the town, it seemed to carry additional weight. Martha listened with tears forming in her eyes, and when the song ended, she sat back in her chair as if she'd been physically moved. "Where did you say you found this?" Tom explained about the buried container, the careful wrapping, the other pieces they had discovered. Martha listened without interruption, but her expression grew more amazed with each detail. "I need to make a phone call," she said finally. "There's someone you need to meet." 20 minutes later, a woman in her 40s entered the Historical Society with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. She was Asian American, professionally dressed despite the early hour, and carried herself with the confidence of an expert in her field. "Dr. Sarah Chen," Martha said by way of introduction. "Meet Tom and Ben Mitchell. Sarah is a curator specializing in American folk art and mechanical devices. She's in town researching some pieces for a museum exhibition." Sarah shook hands with both Tom and Ben, but her attention was immediately drawn to the mechanical bird. She approached it with the reverence of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "This is impossible," she said quietly, pulling a magnifying glass from her bag to examine the bird's mechanisms more closely. "The precision, the artistry. This is museum quality work. Better than museum quality. I've never seen anything quite like it." She opened the journal Tom had brought and began reading the technical notes, her excitement growing with each page. These diagrams, this level of mechanical understanding, combined with this artistic vision, it's extraordinary. The craftsmanship suggests someone trained in both fine woodworking and precision engineering, but the style is entirely unique. "Do you have any idea who might have made it?" Tom asked. Sarah continued studying the journal, comparing the diagrams to the actual bird. There are similarities to the work of some early 20th century automaton makers, but this goes beyond anything I've seen from that period. The integration of the mechanical and artistic elements is seamless. Whoever created this was a master craftsman, possibly self-taught, but with access to precision tools and materials. She paused, looking up from the journal with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. Mr. Mitchell, based on the materials used and the construction techniques, I'd estimate this piece was created sometime in the 1920s or early 1930s. The journal entries you've shown me suggest the maker was working on an entire collection of similar pieces. What would something like this be worth? Ben asked with the directness only children possess. Sarah exchanged a look with Martha before answering. If this is authentic, and I believe it is, and if there are more pieces of similar quality, you could be looking at a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more, depending on the provenance and the story behind the pieces. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Tom felt a familiar mixture of hope and fear, the same feeling he'd experienced each time a doctor had mentioned a new treatment for Emma. Hope that seemed too large to trust, fear of the disappointment that might follow. But here's what's truly remarkable, Sarah continued, turning to a page in the journal covered with sketches of various mechanical creatures. I think I know who made this. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be research notes. There's a legend in folk art circles about a craftsman known only as the Whittling Ghost. He supposedly worked somewhere in rural America during the Depression, creating elaborate mechanical toys and art pieces that were unlike anything anyone had seen before or since. The few pieces attributed to him have sold at auction for extraordinary sums, but his identity was never confirmed. Never confirmed? Martha asked. He disappeared in 1934, Sarah explained. Just vanished, along with whatever workshop he was using, and apparently most of his creations. Some collectors have spent decades trying to track down his work, but until now, only 3 pieces have ever been authenticated as his. She gestured to the mechanical bird. This would be the 4th, and if you have an entire collection, she let the sentence hang in the air. Tom felt the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders. What would we need to do to authenticate the pieces? To find out for certain what we have? I'd need to see the entire collection, Sarah said. Document each piece, research the construction techniques, try to establish a clear provenance. It would take time, but if these pieces are what I think they are, they could change your life, Martha finished quietly. As they drove home, Ben was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing forest. Finally, he spoke. Dad, what? If we're not supposed to sell them? What do you mean? The journal entries you read to me last night, they sounded like someone saying goodbye, like he was leaving the pieces for someone specific to find. What if that someone was us? Tom considered this as they turned into their driveway. What would you want to do with them? I want to understand them first, Ben said, with a maturity that sometimes startled Tom. Mom always said you should understand something before you make decisions about it. Maybe we should figure out who the Whittling Ghost really was before we decide what happens to his work. That evening, as Tom and Ben carefully examined more pieces from the container, Tom realized his son was right. These weren't just valuable artifacts, they were messages from another time, crafted by someone who had poured his heart and skill into every gear and spring and carefully shaped piece of wood. The least they could do was listen to what those messages were trying to say, but even as he made this resolution, Tom couldn't ignore the practical reality of their situation. The back taxes on the property were due in 3 months, and his odd jobs barely covered their basic expenses. If these pieces were truly as valuable as Sarah suggested, they represented a lifeline, not just financial security, but the possibility of building a real future for Ben. The question was whether he could afford to take the time to understand their full significance, or whether necessity would force him to treat them simply as valuable objects to be sold to the highest bidder. As he tucked Ben into bed and listened to the gentle mechanical sounds of the songbird on the nightstand, Tom found himself hoping that somehow there might be a way to honor both needs, to respect the craftsman's legacy while securing his son's future. Tomorrow, Sarah would return to examine the full collection. Whatever they learned then would determine the path forward, but tonight, Tom was content to sit in the quiet cabin and listen to the whispered songs of wood and metal that spoke of dreams and dedication across the span of decades. Sarah Chen returned the next afternoon with a photographer, a portable examination table, and the focused intensity of someone who had spent sleepless hours researching what she had seen. Tom led her and Ben back to the container, now partially excavated and covered with a tarp, to protect it from the morning dew that seemed to cling to everything in these ancient woods. "Before we begin," Sarah said, setting up her equipment with practiced efficiency, "I need you to understand what we might be dealing with. I spent last night going through every database, every auction record, every scholarly article I could access. The whittling ghost isn't just a legend. He's become something of a holy grail in the folk art world." She opened a folder filled with printouts and photographs. "These are the only 3 pieces ever definitively attributed to him. A mechanical owl sold at Sotheby's in 2019 for $180,000. A clockwork horse that went for nearly $300,000 in a private sale. And a music box in the shape of a sailing ship that's currently insured for $400,000 as part of the Smithsonian's collection." Tom felt his mouth go dry. If each piece was worth that much, and they had dozens. "The key word," Sarah continued, "is attributed. None of these pieces came with documentation. No maker's marks, no provenance, just the unmistakable style and craftsmanship that art experts have learned to recognize. What you have is different. You have the artist's own journals, his tools, his workshop materials. If we can establish the connection definitively, we're not just talking about individual pieces. We're talking about the complete artistic legacy of one of America's most mysterious craftsmen." They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully removing and documenting each item from the container. Sarah photographed everything from multiple angles, while Ben kept careful notes in a composition book, recording dimensions and materials with the thoroughness of a natural researcher. Tom found himself both amazed and proud of his son's dedication to the process. It was Ben who discovered the wooden train set, nestled in one of the larger crates and wrapped with particular care. When they unwrapped it, even Sarah gasped. The Shiso-sa locomotive alone was a masterpiece, every rivet individually carved, every piece of trim perfectly proportioned. But it was more than just a model train. Like the mechanical bird, it was a machine, designed to move and function with the precision of a real locomotive, scaled down to fit in a child's hands. The cars that followed were equally extraordinary. A passenger car with tiny figures visible through its windows, each one unique and detailed, down to the expressions on their miniature faces. A freight car that actually opened to reveal a cargo of impossibly small wooden barrels and crates. A caboose with working lanterns that cast real light when wound with a tiny key. But it was the landscape that truly captured their imagination. The train was designed to run on an elaborate wooden track system that folded out into a complete miniature world. Mountains and bridges, towns and farms, all carved with the same obsessive attention to detail that marked every piece they had discovered. Sarah studied the landscape pieces with particular interest. "This tells a story," she said, pointing to various scenes along the track. "Look here. This is a farm family saying goodbye to a son leaving on the train. And here, the same young man arriving in the city, looking up at tall buildings with wonder. It continues around the entire circuit, a coming-of-age story told through wooden figures and mechanical movement." Ben was already working out how to assemble the track, his natural spatial intelligence making sense of the complex interconnecting pieces. "Dad, look at this," he called, pointing to a small building nestled in the landscape's central mountain. "It's a workshop, and there's a figure inside, a man working at a workbench." Tom bent down to look closer. The tiny figure was indeed crafting. Something at his bench, and around the workshop were microscopic versions of the same kinds of pieces they had been discovering all afternoon. The artist had included himself in his own creation, a hidden signature that spoke of pride in his work and perhaps a hope that someday someone would notice the care he had put into every detail. "This changes everything," Sarah said quietly. "This isn't just a collection of individual pieces. It's an integrated artistic vision, a complete world created by one man's imagination and skill. The train set alone would be worth more than any single piece attributed to the whittling ghost, but as part of a complete collection." She trailed off, but Tom understood. They weren't just dealing with valuable antiques. They were the custodians of an artist's complete legacy, perhaps one of the most significant discoveries in American folk art in decades. That evening, after Sarah had left to process her photographs and research, Martha Henley stopped by with a pot of stew and the kind of practical concern that small towns specialize in. She found Tom and Ben still assembling the train set on the cabin's main table, working by lamplight as the mechanical locomotive made its careful circuit through the wooden landscape. "I've been thinking," Martha said, settling into Tom's father's old chair and accepting a cup of coffee, "about what Sarah said about the whittling ghost disappearing in 1934. That was the same year the Whitmore family left town." Tom looked up from the tiny train station he was positioning. Whitmore, Thomas Whitmore. He was a craftsman, worked mostly in wood, but he could fix anything mechanical too. Had a workshop behind his house, always tinkering with something. Folks said he could make wooden gears run smoother than metal ones. What happened to him? Martha stared into her coffee cup as if the answers might be floating there. Hard times hit everyone during the Depression, but Thomas had it worse than most. Lost his boy to influenza in the winter of '33, then his wife to grief not long after. By spring, he'd packed up everything and disappeared. Some said he went west looking for work. Others thought he just couldn't bear to stay in a place with so many memories. Ben had stopped playing with the train and was listening with the intensity he usually reserved for adventure stories. "Mrs. Henley, where did the Whitmores live?" Martha smiled at the boy's directness. "That's the interesting part, young man. They lived right here. This property, this cabin, it was theirs before it was your grandfather's. Your family bought it from the bank after Thomas defaulted on his mortgage." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. The container hadn't been buried by some random stranger. It had been hidden by the original owner of their land, by a man who had lost everything and chosen to preserve his life's work rather than let it be sold to pay his debts. "Are you saying," Tom asked carefully, "that Thomas Whitmore was the whittling ghost?" "I'm saying Thomas Whitmore was a man who could make wood and metal sing," Martha replied. "Whether he was your mysterious artist or not, well, that's for people smarter than me to figure out. But I will say this, if you want to understand what you found, you might want to understand the man who lost everything and still found a way to leave something beautiful behind." After Martha left, Tom and Ben sat in the quiet cabin, watching the mechanical train make its endless circuit through the miniature world. The locomotive's tiny headlight cast moving shadows on the walls, and the soft click of wooden wheels on wooden track provided a rhythmic soundtrack to their thoughts. "Dad," Ben said finally, "if Thomas Whitmore was the whittling ghost and this was his home, then maybe we're not just people who found his work. Maybe we're the people he meant to find it." Tom studied his son's profile in the lamplight, seeing Emma's thoughtfulness in the boy's expression. "What makes you say that?" "The workshop figure in the train set. It's not just any craftsman. It's him, working in a place that looks just like Grandpa's workshop out back. And the story the train tells about the young man leaving home and coming back changed. Maybe that's not just any story. Maybe it's what he hoped would happen to his own work someday." As the mechanical train continued its patient journey through the wooden landscape, Tom found himself thinking about legacy and loss, about the ways people try to reach across time to touch lives they'll never see. Thomas Whitmore had lost his family, his home, his hope, but he had saved his art, hidden it carefully, and waited for someone to understand its value. Tomorrow, Sarah would return with more equipment and possibly some experts from the museum. They would begin the formal process of authentication and evaluation, determining the collection's monetary worth and historical significance. But tonight, sitting in Thomas Whitmore's cabin and watching his mechanical train carry its message across the decades, Tom began to understand that some treasures couldn't be measured in dollars alone. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Tom was in the workshop behind the cabin, trying to repair a broken hinge on the container when he heard car doors slamming and voices carrying through the woods. He emerged to find Sarah Chen talking with a distinguished older man in an expensive suit, while Ben watched from the porch with the wariness of a child who had learned to be suspicious of strangers bearing official-looking documents. "Tom, this is Professor James Hartwell from the American Folk Art Institute," Sarah said by way of introduction. "I took the liberty of sharing some preliminary photos with him yesterday evening." Professor Hartwell stepped forward with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mr. Mitchell, what you've discovered here could be the most significant find in American folk art in 50 years. Dr. Chen's photographs are remarkable, but I needed to see the pieces in person to believe what I was looking at." Tom shook the professor's hand, noting the soft palm and manicured nails of someone who worked with ideas rather than tools. "I appreciate your interest, Professor, but I'm still trying to understand exactly what we have here." "What you have," Hartwell said with the certainty of an expert, "is the complete workshop collection of Thomas Whitmore, better known in art circles as the Whittling Ghost. I've been researching his work for over 20 years, and until yesterday, I wasn't even certain he was a real person rather than a collective myth." They made their way to the container, where Tom and Ben had set up a makeshift examination area under a canvas awning. Professor Hartwell's reaction to seeing the pieces in person was immediate and visceral. He actually gasped when Sarah showed him the mechanical clock they had discovered. That morning, the clock was unlike anything Tom had ever seen. About the size of a shoebox, it was carved from what appeared to be a single block of dark wood, its surface covered with intricate designs that seemed to shift and flow as the light moved across them. But it was more than decorative. It was a functioning timepiece, its mechanical movement visible through crystal panels, its hands moving with precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. "This is it," Hartwell breathed, examining the clock with a magnifying glass. "This is the piece that will prove everything. Look here." He pointed to a small panel on the clock's side that Tom hadn't noticed before. "It's designed to open, but I can't see how." Ben stepped forward with the fearless curiosity that had led to all their discoveries. "May I try, Professor?" At Hartwell's nod, Ben began examining the clock's surface, his small fingers tracing the carved patterns with the sensitivity of someone who understood that mechanical things often had secrets waiting to be discovered. After several minutes of careful exploration, he found what he was looking for: a tiny wooden lever disguised as part of the decorative carving. The hidden panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a compartment that had been sealed for decades. Inside was a photograph, small and sepia-toned, showing a man and a young boy standing in front of the very cabin where they now lived. The man was tall and lean, with calloused hands and the patient eyes of a craftsman. The boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, was looking up at the man with obvious adoration. But it was what was tucked behind the photograph that made Professor Hartwell sit down heavily on a nearby stump. It was a deed, yellowed with age, but still legible, showing the transfer of the property from Thomas Whitmore to the Millbrook Savings and Trust in 1934. Attached to the deed with a rusted paperclip was a handwritten note in the same careful, script they had seen throughout the journals. "To whoever finds this collection," the note read, "I hope you will understand what these pieces meant to me and what I hope they might mean to you. I created each one as a conversation with the future, a way of sharing the joy I found in making something beautiful that might outlast the sadness of losing everything else. The boy in the photograph was my grandson, taken from me too soon. I like to think that somewhere, somehow, another child might find wonder in these toys and machines, might discover the magic that exists when patient hands and loving hearts work together to create something that has never existed before." The note was signed simply TW 1934 and included one more line that made Tom's breath catch. "I am burying this collection on the land that was once my home, in the hope that the earth will keep it safe until the right family comes along to understand its value." He knew, Ben whispered, his voice full of awe. He knew that someday someone would come to live here who would understand what he made. Professor Hartwell was already on his phone, making calls to colleagues and museum directors, his excitement barely contained. But Tom found himself looking at the photograph again, at the love evident between the man and boy, and thinking about the note's reference to conversations with the future. Sarah seemed to understand what he was thinking. "The legal implications of this are significant," she said quietly, while Hartwell continued his animated phone conversation several yards away. "The deed establishes clear provenance. These pieces were created by the original owner of your property and deliberately left here for future owners to find. From a legal standpoint, they're unquestionably yours." "And from a practical standpoint," Tom asked, "Professor Hartwell is already talking about a major museum exhibition, possibly a tour of multiple institutions. The folk art world is going to be very interested in this discovery, which means collectors and dealers will be too. You're going to have options, probably more options than you've ever imagined." As if summoned by her words, another car pulled into their makeshift driveway. This one was a gleaming black SUV, and the man who emerged from it carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the kind of casual way that suggested expensive tailoring, and he approached their group with the focused intensity of a predator who had spotted prey. "Marcus Webb," he said, extending a hand to Tom. "I represent several private collectors who specialize in American mechanical art. I understand you've made quite a discovery." Tom shook the man's hand reluctantly, noting the firm grip and calculating eyes. "News travels fast. In my business it has to," Webb said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Time is often the difference between securing a piece and losing it to bureaucracy. I'm prepared to make you an offer today. Cash, no questions asked, no waiting for authentication or exhibition planning." Professor Hartwell looked up from his phone call with visible irritation. "Mr. Webb, these pieces haven't even been properly catalogued yet, much less appraised. Any discussion of sale is premature. Professor, with all due respect, Mr. Mitchell has bills to pay and a son to raise. He doesn't have the luxury of waiting months or years for the academic world to make up its mind about his collection's value." Webb turned back to Tom. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 for the entire collection, cash, within 24 hours. The offer hit Tom like a physical blow. $500,000 would solve every problem he had, would give Ben opportunities Tom had never dared to dream of. But even as the practical part of his mind began calculating what that money could mean, another part, the part that had been listening to mechanical birds sing and watching toy trains carry their stories through miniature landscapes, rebelled against the idea of reducing Thomas Whitmore's life work to a simple transaction. "That's generous," Tom said carefully, "but I think we need more time to understand what we're dealing with." Webb's smile became fixed. "Time is expensive, Mr. Mitchell. The longer you wait, the more people will hear about this discovery, and the more complicated things will become. I've seen situations like this turn into legal nightmares that drag on for years while lawyers get rich and families get nothing. Is that a threat? Sarah asked, her voice sharp with professional displeasure. It's reality, Webb replied smoothly. I'm offering a clean, simple transaction that gives Mr. Mitchell financial security and collectors the opportunity to preserve these pieces in appropriate settings. Everyone wins. But Ben had been listening to the entire exchange with the focused attention he usually reserved for solving puzzles, and now he spoke up with the directness that was his trademark. Mr. Webb, do you know what these pieces are supposed to do? Besides just sit in someone's collection, I mean. Webb looked down at the boy with barely concealed impatience. They're valuable art objects, son. Their purpose is to be preserved and appreciated. But they're not just art objects, Ben insisted. They're machines. They're supposed to move and make music and tell stories. If you put them in collections where nobody can touch them or wind them up, then they're not really doing what Mr. Whitmore made them to do. The simplicity of the observation struck everyone silent. Webb recovered first, his professional mask slipping back into place. The preservation of these pieces is more important than their function. They're almost a century old. Using them would only accelerate their deterioration. Thomas Whitmore made them to be used, Tom said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. His note talks about sharing the joy he found in creating, about children finding wonder in these toys and machines. I don't think he hid them away so they could sit untouched in display cases. Webb's expression hardened. Mr. Mitchell, I understand the sentimental appeal of that interpretation, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or secure futures. My offer stands through tomorrow evening. After that, well, the market for discoveries like this can be quite volatile. As Webb drove away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and implied threats hanging in the morning air, Tom found himself faced with the first really difficult decision he'd had to make since Emma's death. The practical choice was obvious. Take the money, secure Ben's future, trust that the pieces would be properly cared for by people who understood their value. But the right choice felt much more complicated, tangled up with questions about legacy and responsibility and the promises we make to people we've never met, but somehow feel obligated to honor. Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the time Tom and Ben made their weekly trip to the grocery store 2 days later, it seemed like everyone in town had heard some version of the story. The details varied wildly. Some people thought they'd found buried treasure, others believed it was an old bootlegger's cache, and a few were convinced it was somehow connected to UFOs. But everyone agreed that the Mitchells had stumbled onto something significant. Mrs. Henderson at the checkout counter was more direct than most. Tom, honey, I heard you found something valuable out there at your place. I hope you know what you're doing with all these city folks sniffing around. Sometimes the first offer is the best offer, if you know what I mean. Tom nodded politely, but he could see Ben processing the conversation with the analytical mind that Emma had always said would either make him a great scientist or get him into serious trouble. As they loaded groceries into the truck, Ben finally spoke up. Dad, are you worried about Mr. Webb's offer expiring? Worried isn't the right word, Tom said, though worry was exactly what he'd been feeling for the past 48 hours. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thinking about it. They drove home through the forest road that had become familiar, past the landmarks that Ben had named during their first weeks in the cabin. The lightning tree split by some long-ago storm, the troll bridge that was really just a culvert but looked magical in the right light, the wild apple grove where deer came to feed in the early morning. It occurred to Tom that this was the first place since Emma's death that had started to feel like home rather than just a temporary refuge. Back at the cabin, they found Sarah Chen waiting on the porch with several boxes of equipment and the slightly frazzled expression of someone who had spent the night making difficult phone calls. I have news, she said without preamble. Good news and complicated news. Let's start with the good news, Tom said, settling into one of the porch chairs, while Ben immediately began investigating Sarah's equipment boxes with his usual curiosity. The authentication is proceeding faster than I expected. Professor Hartwell has colleagues at 3 major universities working on different aspects of the collection, and they're all reaching the same conclusion. This is definitely the work of Thomas Whitmore, and it represents the most complete collection of his pieces ever discovered. She opened one of her boxes and pulled out what appeared to be a chess set, its wooden pieces carved with extraordinary detail. But as she arranged them on the board that had been packed with careful precision, Tom realized this was another of Whitmore's mechanical marvels. "I wanted you to see this before anyone else," Sarah continued. "It was in the deepest part of the container, wrapped with extra care. I think it might be his masterpiece." The chess set was unlike anything Tom had ever imagined. Each piece was a tiny work of art. The pawns were foot soldiers in medieval armor, each one unique, while the more powerful pieces were elaborate figures that seemed to tell stories through their carved details. The king was a wise-looking ruler holding a tiny scepter, the queen a fierce warrior with flowing robes that seemed to move in an invisible breeze. But it was when Sarah wound a small key hidden in the board's base that the true magic revealed itself. The pieces began to move on their own, sliding across the board in response to some internal logic that had been programmed into their mechanisms 90 years ago. They weren't just playing a random game, they were recreating famous chess matches. From history, their movements precise and purposeful. "It's programmed to play through 12 classical games," Sarah explained, as they watched the pieces glide across the board with mechanical precision. Each game represents a different era and playing style. But here's what's remarkable. Whitmore somehow designed it so that a human player can interrupt the automatic play at any point and take control of either side. Ben was already studying the board with the intensity he brought to any puzzle. "So it's like playing chess with someone from the past?" "That's exactly what it is," Sarah said with a smile. "Thomas Whitmore programmed his own chess knowledge into this set, creating a way for future players to match their skills against his understanding of the game." As they watched the mechanical pieces continue their elegant dance across the board, Sarah delivered what she had called the complicated news. The folk art world is very excited about this discovery, but that excitement comes with complications. Professor Hartwell has been fielding calls from museums, private collectors, and what he politely calls interested parties from around the world. Everyone wants to see the collection, and many of them want to own pieces of it. Like Mr. Webb. Marcus Webb is just the beginning. There are collectors in New York, Los Angeles, London, and Tokyo who would pay extraordinary sums for individual pieces. The mechanical bird alone could bring in $200,000 at the right auction. Tom felt that familiar twist in his stomach that came whenever large sums of money entered the conversation. "Sarah, I need you to be straight with me. What are we really talking about here in terms of value?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As a complete collection, properly authenticated and with the provenance documentation you found, we're looking at somewhere between $3 and $5 million. Individual pieces sold separately could bring in even more. But you'd lose the historical significance of keeping the collection intact." The number hung in the air between them like a tangible thing. $5 million. Enough to buy Ben any future he wanted, enough to ensure that Tom never again had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. "But there's something else," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested this was the part of the conversation she'd been dreading. "Professor Hartwell received a call this morning from a law firm in Boston. It seems that Marcus Webb has been doing some genealogy research." "What kind of research?" Tom asked, though he suspected. He didn't want to know the answer. He's found living descendants of Thomas Whitmore's family line, a great-nephew in Massachusetts, a distant cousin in Oregon, and at least 2 other relatives who might have legal claims to the collection. The chess pieces continued their mechanical game, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. Tom watched a wooden knight leap over a pawn in its programmed attack pattern, and wondered if Thomas Whitmore had ever imagined that his carefully hidden legacy would become the center of a legal battle nearly a century later. "What does that mean for us?" Ben asked, his voice smaller than usual. Sarah's expression was gentle but honest. "It means that even though the collection was found on your property, and even though Thomas Whitmore clearly intended it to be discovered by future residents, there could be legal challenges to your ownership. Family members might argue that they have inheritance rights that supersede property rights, even though he abandoned the property and left the collection behind deliberately." Property law can be complicated, especially when valuable discoveries are involved. The good news is that the deed and note you found establish strong evidence of Whitmore's intent. He clearly wanted the collection to be found by the people living on his former land, but intent doesn't always determine legal outcome, Tom felt. The familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded suspiciously like the hospital billing department, was screaming at him to take Webb's offer before any legal complications could arise. $500,000, cash. No questions asked, no waiting for courts to sort out inheritance claims that might drag on for years. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, reminded him of Thomas Whitmore's note, of the love in that sepia photograph, of the careful way each piece had been wrapped and preserved. This wasn't just about money. It was about honoring a promise made across time by a man who had lost everything but still believed in the power of beauty to heal and inspire. How long would we have before any legal challenges could be filed? Tom asked. It's hard to say. Webb's people are moving fast, which suggests they're hoping to pressure you into a quick sale before complications arise. But if legitimate family members come forward with valid claims, it could be months or even years before ownership is finally determined. Ben had been quietly studying the chess set while the adults talked, but now he looked up with the expression that usually meant he'd figured something out. "Dad, what if we don't have to choose between keeping the collection together and selling it?" "What do you mean?" "Well, museums buy things sometimes, right? And they display them so people can see them and learn from them. What if we could sell the collection to a museum that would promise to keep it together and let people actually see the pieces working?" Sarah's expression brightened. "That's actually not a bad idea. There are several museums that specialize in mechanical art and folk crafts. They would value the educational and historical significance of keeping the collection intact, and they might be able to offer competitive prices while ensuring proper preservation and public access. Would that help with the legal issues?" Tom asked. It could. Museums are less likely to be seen as trying to exploit a questionable legal situation, and courts tend to look favorably on outcomes that preserve cultural heritage for public benefit rather than private profit. As if summoned by their conversation about legal complications, another car pulled into their driveway. This time it was a modest sedan, and the woman who emerged was dressed in the kind of practical business attire that suggested competence without ostentation. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "Mr. Mitchell," she called as she approached the porch. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the law firm of Walsh and Associates. I specialize in property law and inheritance disputes. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." Tom felt his stomach drop. So it was starting already. The legal complications that would turn Thomas Whitmore's gift into a battleground for people who had never known him and didn't understand what his work meant. "Before you say anything," Jennifer continued, apparently reading his expression, "I should clarify that I'm not here representing any claimants to your collection. I'm here because a friend of mine at the State Historical Society thought you might need some advice about protecting your legal position." "What kind of advice?" Sarah asked, her professional instincts clearly activated. the kind that might prevent this discovery from becoming a legal nightmare that benefits no one except the lawyers, Jennifer said with a slight smile. May I sit down? I think we have some things to discuss that could affect how you handle the next few weeks. As Jennifer settled into one of the porch chairs, Tom found himself hoping that Thomas Whitmore's faith in leaving his treasures for the right family to find hadn't been misplaced. The collection was becoming more complicated by the day, but it was also revealing the kinds of choices that defined not just financial futures, but the legacy people leave behind and the promises they make to strangers across time. Jennifer Walsh proved to be exactly what Tom hadn't dared to hope for. A lawyer who seemed genuinely interested in finding the right solution rather than the most profitable one. Over coffee and Martha Henley's homemade cookies, she explained the legal landscape they were navigating with a clarity that made complex issues understandable. The good news is that your position is stronger than Marcus Webb would like you to believe, she began, spreading several documents across the porch table. The deed and note you found establish what we call clear intent of abandonment with specific bequest. Thomas Whitmore didn't just abandon the property, he deliberately left the collection for future property owners to find. But what about the family members Webb mentioned? Tom asked. They exist, and they'll probably surface eventually, but their claims aren't as strong as Webb is implying. When someone abandons property with clear intent that it be transferred to others, inheritance rights become much more complicated to enforce, especially when nearly a century has passed and the family made no effort to claim or search for the items. She pulled out what appeared to be a weather monitoring device, one of the pieces Tom and Ben had discovered earlier that week. Unlike the other mechanical creations, this one seemed purely functional. A barometer, thermometer, and wind gauge combined into a single elegant wooden cabinet about the size of a thick book. This piece particularly interested me, Jennifer continued, because it's still working. I tested it against current weather service predictions, and it's remarkably accurate. Ben leaned forward with interest. How does it work without electricity or digital sensors? Old-fashioned mechanical principles, Jennifer explained. Whitmore understood how changes in air pressure, humidity, and temperature affect different materials. This device uses combinations of wood, metal, and what appears to be human hair to detect atmospheric changes and predict weather patterns up to 48 hours in advance. She demonstrated the device's various indicators, pointing out how tiny mechanical movements translated into weather predictions displayed on a series of small dials. It was like having a conversation with the atmosphere itself, mediated through Thomas Whitmore's understanding of natural forces. Why are you interested in the weather device specifically? Sarah asked. Because it represents something important in establishing Whitmore's intent, Jennifer said. This isn't just an art piece or a toy. It's a practical tool designed to help people. All of his pieces seem to have that quality, but this one makes it explicit. He wasn't creating objects to be admired from a distance. He was creating functional beauty, things meant to be part of daily life. As if to underscore her point, the device's wind indicator suddenly shifted, and within minutes, Tom could hear the sound of approaching rain through the forest canopy. The three adults and Ben hurried to cover the chess set and move their conversation. Inside, where the mechanical train continued its patient circuit through the wooden landscape on the main table. There's something else you should know, Jennifer continued, once they were settled in the cabin's main room. I've been researching Marcus Webb, and his reputation isn't as clean as he'd like you to believe. He's been involved in several questionable acquisitions over the past decade, situations where families were pressured into quick sales of valuable items without proper authentication or fair market evaluation. Is that illegal? Tom asked. Not necessarily, but it's ethically questionable, and in at least 2 cases, those quick sales later proved to be worth significantly more than Webb paid. The families had no recourse because they'd signed contracts giving up all future claims. Sarah frowned. That explains why he's pushing so hard for a fast decision. It also explains why you shouldn't make that decision under pressure, Jennifer said. Tom, you and Ben have something extraordinary here, but you also have time to make smart choices about its future. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Over the next hour, Jennifer helped them understand their options in practical terms. They could sell the collection as a unit to a museum or institution, which would likely offer less money but provide better assurance that Whitmore's work would be preserved and accessible to the public. They could sell to private collectors, either as a complete collection or individual pieces, which might bring in more money but would scatter the work and possibly hide it from public view. Or they could loan the collection to a museum while retaining ownership, which would provide some income while keeping future options open. There's a fourth option, Ben said, with the matter-of-fact tone he used when stating obvious solutions that adults had somehow missed. We could keep some pieces and sell others. The adults looked at him with varying degrees of surprise. I mean, Ben continued, warming to his theme, there are dozens of pieces, right? We could keep the ones that are most important to us, like the bird that sings and the weather predictor and maybe the chess set, and sell some of the others to make sure we have enough money for important things. Tom felt a familiar surge of pride in his son's practical wisdom. That's not a bad idea, but how would we decide which pieces to keep and which to sell? Easy, Ben said, as if the answer should be obvious. We keep the ones that do things, that work the way Mr. Whitmore meant them to work, the ones that would just sit in display cases. Those are the ones we could sell to people who collect. Things, Sarah nodded slowly. From a curatorial standpoint, that makes sense. The interactive pieces, the ones with clear functional purposes, would be ideal for educational displays. The purely decorative pieces, while beautiful, might be better suited for private collectors who would appreciate their artistic value. And legally, Jennifer added, partial sales would establish your clear ownership of the remaining pieces. If family members wanted to challenge your right to the collection, they'd have a much harder time after you'd already legally sold portions of it. As the afternoon rain drummed against the cabin's windows, Tom found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced since before Emma's illness, a sense that good choices were possible, that the future held options rather than just survival. The weather device had accurately predicted the storm, and now it was suggesting that clearing skies would follow by evening. There was something reassuring about Thomas Whitmore's mechanical faith in the predictable patterns underlying apparent chaos. That evening, after Jennifer had left and Sarah had returned to her hotel to process the day's photographs and documentation, Tom and Ben sat at the kitchen table and made a list. On one side, they wrote down the pieces that seemed most meant for interaction and daily use: the mechanical bird, the weather device, the chess set, the working clock. On the other side, they listed the pieces that, while beautiful, seemed designed primarily for observation and appreciation. Dad, Ben said as they worked, do you think Mr. Whitmore knew that someday someone would have to make choices like this about his work? Tom considered the question while watching the mechanical train make its endless journey through the miniature landscape. I think he was a practical man who understood that life rarely gives us perfect solutions. He probably hoped his work would survive intact, but he would have understood that sometimes the best way to preserve something is to make difficult choices about its future. Like you and Mom did about her treatments? The question caught Tom off guard, but he recognized the careful way Ben was connecting new experiences to old understanding. Yes, like that. Sometimes loving something means making hard decisions about what's best for it, even when those decisions aren't what you'd choose in a perfect world. As they finished their list and prepared for bed, Tom realized that the collection had given him something besides financial security. It had given him a framework for thinking about legacy and responsibility, about the ways people try to reach across time to touch lives they'll never see. Thomas Whitmore had faced impossible choices and found a way to preserve what mattered most. Now Tom was faced with his own impossible choices. But unlike the devastating decisions of Emma's final months, these felt like choices with good outcomes, rather than tragic ones. Tomorrow, Sarah would return with final authentication documents, and the formal process of deciding the collection's future would begin. But tonight, listening to the gentle mechanical sounds that filled the cabin and watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in months, Tom felt ready to honor both Thomas Whitmore's legacy and his own family's needs. The revelation came from an unexpected source: Ben's relentless curiosity about the workshop figure in the miniature train landscape. While Sarah and Tom discussed authentication details on the porch, Ben had been studying the tiny carved craftsman with a magnifying glass, trying to understand why something about the figure bothered him. "Dad, you need to see this," Ben called, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery mixed with confusion. "The workshop figure. It's holding something, and I think it's important." Tom and Sarah joined Ben at the table where the train set was displayed. Under magnification, the tiny figure was indeed holding what appeared to be a miniature version of one of the pieces they had discovered, a small mechanical device that seemed to be a theater or music box of some kind. "I've been comparing it to everything we've found," Ben continued, "and this doesn't match any of the actual pieces. It's like Mr. Whitmore was showing us something he made that we haven't found yet." Sarah frowned, studying the carved detail through the magnifying glass. "You're right. This appears to be a mechanical theater, but much more elaborate than anything we've documented. Look at the tiny figures visible in the theater's windows. There are dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Where would he have hidden something that large?" Tom wondered aloud. Ben was already thinking ahead. "The root cellar. We found the container behind it, but we never looked inside the cellar itself. What if there's more than one hiding place?" 20 minutes later, they stood before the heavy wooden doors that covered the stone-lined pit Tom's grandfather had used for storing vegetables. The doors were older than Tom remembered, and when they managed to heave them open, the space revealed below was larger and more sophisticated than a simple root cellar should have been. Stone steps led down into a chamber that had been carved directly into the hillside, its walls lined with the same careful stonework that characterized the best craftsmanship of the early 20th century. But it was what filled the chamber that took their breath away. The mechanical theater was Thomas Whitmore's masterpiece, a device so complex and ambitious that it defied immediate understanding. About the size of a large dining room table, it was constructed on multiple levels, with intricate wooden mechanisms visible through crystal panels and tiny stages arranged in a spiral that drew the eye upward toward a central platform. But unlike the other pieces they had discovered, this one was obviously incomplete. Gaps in the mechanism showed where components were missing, and several of the tiny stages contained only half-finished figures. Tools lay scattered around the theater as if Whitmore had been working on it when something forced him to stop suddenly. "It's unfinished," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe and sadness. "This was his life's work, and he never got to complete it." They found more journals in the cellar, these ones focused entirely on the theater project. The entries painted a picture of obsessive dedication mixed with growing despair. Whitmore had begun the theater as a gift for his grandson, designing it to tell the story of their life together through mechanical performances. But as his family was lost to illness and economic hardship, the project had become something else, a desperate attempt to preserve memories that seemed to be slipping away faster than he could capture them. "I cannot finish what I began," one entry read, dated just weeks before Whitmore's disappearance. "The theater requires a kind of joy that has been taken from me. But perhaps someday someone will find these pieces and understand what I was trying to create. Perhaps they will have the heart to complete what my broken spirit cannot." The journal entries revealed something else that changed everything Tom thought he understood about their situation. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just owned their property, He had been Tom's great-grandfather, his grandfather's father, who had died before Tom was born. The family connection explained not just why the collection had been hidden on their land, but why Ben seemed to have such an intuitive understanding of how the mechanical devices worked. "This changes the legal situation completely," Sarah said as they studied the family tree sketched in one of Whitmore's journals. "You're not just the current property owners who found a buried collection. You're direct descendants with clear inheritance rights." But Tom was focused on something else, a set of technical drawings showing the theater's missing components. The diagrams were incredibly detailed, showing exactly what needed to be constructed to complete Whitmore's vision. And unlike the elaborate mechanical pieces they had already discovered, these missing components seemed to be within the range of skills that Tom had learned during his years of odd jobs and repairs. "Ben," he said slowly, "what would you think about trying to finish what our ancestor started?" Ben's eyes went wide as he studied the drawings. "Could we really do that? Build the missing pieces ourselves?" "I think we might be able to," Tom said, his mind already working through the technical challenges. "It would take time, and we'd have to learn some techniques we've never used before, but the plans are here, and so are most of his original tools." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the cellar workshop that Whitmore had carved into the hillside. Unlike the buried container, this space had been designed as a working environment. Hand tools hung in careful rows, their steel still bright after decades of careful preservation. Woodstock of various types was stacked and labeled with notes about grain patterns and working properties. Most remarkably, Whitmore had left detailed instructions for maintaining and using every piece of equipment in the shop. "It's like he expected someone from his family to eventually find this place and continue his work," Sarah observed. "Or maybe he just couldn't bear the thought of his tools going unused," Tom said, running his hand along the smooth surface of a workbench that had been lovingly maintained despite decades of abandonment. That evening, Marcus Webb made another unexpected visit, this time accompanied by a man he introduced as his technical consultant. But Tom could see in the consultant's eyes the same calculating assessment he had learned to recognize in hospital administrators and insurance adjusters. The look of someone evaluating assets rather than understanding their meaning. "I understand. You've made additional discoveries," Webb said without preamble. "I'm prepared to increase my offer to $750,000 for everything, including whatever new pieces you've found." "That's generous," Tom said carefully, "but our situation has become more complicated." "Complications are exactly what I'm trying to help you avoid," Webb replied. "I've been in contact with several family members who are prepared to challenge your ownership claims. Legal battles over valuable discoveries can drag on for years, consuming whatever value they might have in attorney fees and court costs." His companion, who had been silently photographing the train set and chess pieces, looked up from his camera. "These pieces show some condition issues that will affect their market value. The longer they remain in an uncontrolled environment, the more deterioration we can expect." Ben had been listening to the conversation with growing indignation, and now he spoke up with the kind of directness that made adults uncomfortable. "They're not deteriorating. They're working exactly the way Mr. Whitmore made them to work. The train runs perfectly, and the chess set plays real games, and the weather device predicted yesterday's rain." "Son," Webb's consultant said with condescending patience, "these are 90-year-old mechanical devices. Every time they're operated, internal components wear down. Proper preservation requires environmental controls and minimal handling." "But Mr. Whitmore didn't make them to sit in display cases," Ben insisted. "He made them to be used and enjoyed. If you don't let them do what they're supposed to do, then they're not really his creations anymore. They're just expensive decorations." The exchange crystallized something Tom had been thinking about since Jennifer Walsh's visit. This wasn't just about money or legal ownership. It was about the fundamental question of what it meant to preserve an artist's legacy. Did preservation mean keeping physical objects safe from the ravages of time? Or did it mean honoring the creator's intent and allowing his work to fulfill its designed purpose? "Mr. Webb," Tom said finally, "I appreciate your offer, but we've decided to take a different approach. We're going to complete the collection the way Thomas Whitmore intended, and then we'll make decisions about its future based on what we learn in that process." Webb's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Mitchell, I hope you understand the risks you're taking. Legal challenges, market fluctuations, the costs of proper conservation, these can all erode the value of what you've found very quickly." "Some things are worth more than their market value," Tom replied. After Webb and his consultant left, Tom, Ben, and Sarah returned to the underground workshop to study Whitmore's plans for the mechanical theatre. The project would be ambitious, requiring skills in precision woodworking, mechanical engineering, and artistic design that none of them fully possessed. But as they examined the detailed drawings and read the careful instructions Whitmore had left behind, Tom began to believe it might be possible. "It'll take months," he told Ben as they prepared for bed. "And there's no guarantee we'll be able to make everything work the way he intended. But if we can do it," Ben said with the kind of certainty that had led to all their best discoveries, "we'll be finishing something that someone in our family started almost 100 years ago. That seems worth trying." As Tom turned off the lights and listened to the familiar sounds of mechanical devices gently operating throughout the cabin, he realized that Ben was right. They had found more than a valuable collection. They had found a connection to their own history and a project that might help them understand what Thomas Whitmore had been trying to say across the decades about love and loss and the human desire to create something beautiful that might outlast our own brief time on Earth. The next 3 months transformed both the cabin and the relationship between Tom and Ben in ways neither had expected. The underground workshop became their shared classroom, where Tom's practical skills and Ben's intuitive understanding of mechanical principles combined to tackle challenges that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. They began with the simpler missing components, gear trains and linkages that connected the theatre's various stages to its central timing mechanism. Tom discovered that his years of odd jobs had given him more relevant skills than he'd realized, while Ben's natural curiosity about how things worked made him surprisingly adept at understanding Whitmore's mechanical logic. Sarah had become a regular visitor, documenting their progress while also serving as a liaison with the growing community of scholars and institutions interested in the collection. Professor Hartwell made weekly trips from the university, bringing expertise in historical mechanical devices and occasionally just watching in amazement as Tom and Ben brought nearly century-old plans to life. "What you're attempting here has never been done," he told them during one of his visits, as Tom carefully shaped a tiny wooden gear using tools that had belonged to Thomas Whitmore himself. Completing an unfinished work by a master craftsman using his original plans and tools. It's like an archaeologist not just discovering an ancient text, but actually finishing the story the original author left incomplete. The technical challenges were significant, but the emotional ones proved even more complex. As they worked to complete the theatre, Tom and Ben found themselves having conversations about Emma, about loss, and about the ways people try to hold onto what matters most when everything else seems to be changing too quickly to control. "Why do you think Mr. Whitmore couldn't finish it himself?" Ben asked one afternoon as they worked on installing tiny figures in one of the theatre's performance spaces. Tom considered the question while carefully positioning a miniature wooden dancer. The journals suggest he started losing heart after his family died. Maybe creating something meant to celebrate life and family became too painful when he'd lost the people who would have shared that joy with him. "But we have each other," Ben said matter-of-factly, "So maybe we can finish it because we understand what he was trying to create, but we're not too sad to keep working on it." The insight surprised Tom with its accuracy. Working on the theatre had indeed become a way of processing their own grief, of finding something constructive to do with the energy that had previously been consumed by loss and worry about the future. Meanwhile, the outside world continued to complicate their peaceful project. Marcus Webb's promised legal challenges had materialized in the form of a lawsuit filed by distant Whitmore relatives, though Jennifer Walsh assured them that the family connection Tom had discovered significantly strengthened their position. More problematically, word of the mechanical theatre had leaked to collectors and museums around the world, creating a pressure that felt increasingly intense with each passing day. The Smithsonian has made a preliminary offer of $1.2 million for the theatre alone, assuming you can get it working, Sarah reported during one of her visits. The Metropolitan Museum is interested in the entire collection for a major exhibition, and there are private collectors in Europe who are offering sums that I honestly can't believe are real. What kind of sums? Tom asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The kind that would set Ben up for life, pay for any education he wanted, and leave enough left over for you to never worry about money again. Tom looked across the workshop, where Ben was carefully studying one of Whitmore's diagrams, trying to understand the mechanism that would bring the theatre's central performance to life. The boy had grown visibly in the past months, not just physically, but in confidence and capability. The project had given him something he'd been missing since Emma's death, a sense of purpose and accomplishment that came from working on something larger than himself. "Sarah," Tom said quietly, "what happens if we finish the theatre and then sell it? I mean, what happens to the work we've done, to the project itself?" "That would depend on who buys it," Sarah replied honestly. "A museum would likely display it as both a historical artifact and a demonstration of restoration techniques. Private collectors, well, some would appreciate the functional aspects, while others might see the restoration work as reducing the authenticity of the original." The conversation was interrupted by Ben's excited call from across the workshop. "Dad, I think I figured it out. The central mechanism, it's not just a performance space, it's a story selector." Tom and Sarah hurried over to where Ben was pointing at a complex arrangement of gears and switches that formed the heart of the theatre's timing system. "Look at these settings," Ben continued. "Each position of this main dial corresponds to a different story program. Mr. Whitmore designed it so that the theatre could tell different stories depending on which setting you chose." Sarah examined the mechanism through her magnifying glass. "You're right. This is far more sophisticated than I realized. It's not just a mechanical toy. It's a programmable storytelling device." Over the following weeks, as they worked to complete, the theatre's central mechanism, the true scope of Whitmore's vision, became clear. He had designed the device to tell 12 different stories, each one a self-contained narrative that played out across the theatre's various stages using hundreds of tiny mechanical figures. The stories ranged from fairy tales to historical events to what appeared to be scenes from his own life, all coordinated by a timing system that was decades ahead of its time in terms of complexity and precision. He was creating a library of stories that could be experienced rather than just read, Professor Hartwell observed as they tested one of the completed story sequences. Each performance would be identical to the last, but the viewer's experience would be different based on where they focused their attention, what details they noticed, how the stories connected to their own experiences. The most challenging aspect of the project proved to be the theatre's master tools and final blueprint, the original plans that would allow them to calibrate the entire system and ensure that all 12 story programs worked in harmony. These documents had been carefully preserved in a sealed container within the workshop, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected by the same attention to detail that characterized everything else Whitmore had created. The plans revealed that the theatre was designed not just as entertainment, but as a kind of mechanical memory palace, a way of preserving stories and experiences that might otherwise be lost to time. Each story program contained layers of meaning that became apparent only through repeated viewings, and the theatre's design encouraged interaction, allowing viewers to influence certain aspects of each performance. It's like he was trying to create a conversation between the past and the future, Ben observed, as they studied the master blueprints. The stories he programmed would always be the same, but the people watching them would be different, so the meanings would keep changing. As winter approached and their work neared completion, Tom found himself facing the most difficult decision he'd had to make since Emma's death. The theatre was almost functional, missing only a few final components and the delicate calibration. Work that would bring all 12-story programs online, but pressure from collectors, museums, and lawyers was intensifying daily. And Jennifer Walsh had warned him that they couldn't delay major decisions much longer without risking legal complications that might drag on for years. The irony is, Tom told Ben one evening as they worked by lamplight in the underground workshop, we're almost at the point where we can see what Thomas Whitmore was trying to create, but we may have to decide what happens to it before we fully understand what it means. Maybe that's okay, Ben replied with the wisdom that still surprised Tom. Maybe Mr. Whitmore knew that the people who found his work would have to make their own choices about its future, just like he had to make choices about hiding it in the first place. The next morning brought news that would force those choices to be made sooner than Tom had hoped. Sarah arrived with a legal document and an expression that suggested the comfortable rhythm of their project was about to be disrupted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Marcus Webb has filed an injunction, she announced without preamble. He's arguing that your restoration work is damaging the historical integrity of the collection, and he's asking the court to freeze all activities until ownership can be definitively determined. Tom felt the familiar weight of impossible circumstances settling on his shoulders, but this time it was mixed with something he hadn't felt in months: anger at the idea that someone would try to stop them from completing work that Thomas Whitmore had clearly intended to be finished. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The hearing is set for next week. If the injunction is granted, you'll have to stop all work on the theatre and turn the collection over to court-appointed custodians until the legal issues are resolved." That afternoon, Tom and Ben worked with an urgency they hadn't felt since the early days of their discovery. They had perhaps a week to complete nearly a century-old project, to honor a promise made by a man they had never met, but somehow felt they knew intimately. The master tools were ready, the final blueprints decoded, and the intricate calibration work that would bring Thomas Whitmore's vision to life was finally within their reach. As evening approached, and they prepared for what might be their final days in the underground workshop, Tom realized that regardless of what happened in court, they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had formed a connection across time with a craftsman who had poured his heart into preserving stories and dreams for people he would never meet. Whether they could complete his work or not, they had honored his faith in the future and discovered something about their own capacity to create rather than just survive. Tomorrow, they would begin the final phase of the project, racing against legal deadlines to finish what Thomas Whitmore had started with such hope and been forced to abandon in such sorrow. The final week before the court hearing became a race against time that tested everything Tom and Ben had learned about Thomas Whitmore's methods and their own abilities as craftsmen. They worked from dawn until well past sunset, driven by the knowledge that if Marcus Webb's injunction was granted, the theatre might never be completed. The key mechanism that would coordinate all 12-story programs was the most complex component. They had attempted to build According to Whitmore's plans, it required precision that was nearly impossible to achieve with hand tools, timing that had to be calibrated to fractions of a second, and an understanding of mechanical principles that pushed both father and son to the limits of their abilities. "The timing wheel is the heart of everything," Tom explained to Ben as they worked together on the intricate brass disc that would control the theater's master sequences. "If we get this wrong, none of the stories will synchronize properly. Everything depends on this one piece working exactly right." Ben studied Whitmore's diagrams with the focused intensity he had inherited from his mother. "Dad, look at this notation here. He says the timing has to account for settling time after each performance. What do you think that means?" Tom examined the note Ben was pointing to. In Whitmore's careful handwriting, it read, "Allow 47 seconds between programs for mechanism to return to neutral state. The stories need time to breathe before the next tale begins." "I think it means the theater wasn't designed just for continuous operation," Tom realized. Whitmore understood that stories need space between them, time for the audience to absorb what they've seen before moving on to the next narrative. They had been working on the timing mechanism for 3 days when Tom made a mistake that nearly ended the project. While adjusting one of the smaller gears, his hand slipped and a spring under tension snapped free, sending tiny components scattering across the workshop floor. For a moment that felt like hours, Tom stared at the damaged mechanism and felt the weight of nearly a century of patient craftsmanship potentially destroyed by a single careless moment. "It's okay, Dad," Ben said quietly, though Tom could hear the disappointment in his son's voice. "We can fix it. Mr. Whitmore would have made mistakes too when he was building these things the first time. But when they tried to reassemble the scattered components, they discovered that one crucial piece, a tiny gear that controlled the transition between story programs, had been damaged beyond repair. Without it, the theater could run individual stories but couldn't shift smoothly from one narrative to another. "Can we make a replacement?" Ben asked, though they both knew the answer. The gear's teeth were so small and precisely shaped that duplicating it would require tools and skills they didn't possess. Tom sat back on his heels and stared at the incomplete mechanism, feeling defeat settle over him like a weight he'd carried. Before, they had come so close, had invested so much time and hope in completing Whitmore's vision, only to be stopped by a single broken component no bigger than a button. Maybe this is what Whitmore meant when he said the theater required one kind of joy he couldn't provide, Tom said finally. Maybe some projects aren't meant to be finished by the people who start them. But Ben was still studying the broken mechanism with the persistence that had led to every breakthrough they'd achieved. "Dad, what if the gear isn't supposed to be perfect? Look at these wear marks on the other components. Mr. Whitmore used this theater, at least partially. What if he designed it to work even with imperfect parts?" Tom looked more closely at the mechanism, seeing for the first time the subtle evidence of use that Ben had noticed. Several components showed the kind of wear that came from operation rather than age, suggesting that Whitmore had indeed tested at least portions of his creation before circumstances forced him to abandon it. "You might be right," Tom admitted. "But how do we test that theory without risking damage to the rest of the mechanism?" Ben was already reaching for a piece of scrap wood. "We make a temporary gear, just good enough to test whether the theater can compensate for imperfect components. If it works, then maybe Mr. Whitmore was smarter than we thought about designing for real-world conditions." The temporary gear that Ben carved over the next 2 hours was clearly inferior to Whitmore's precision standards, but it was functional enough to allow the mechanism to operate. When they installed it and activated the theater's power system, Tom held his breath as the complex arrangement of gears and springs began to move. The first story program started smoothly, with tiny figures emerging onto their designated stages, to begin a performance that told the tale of a farmer and his family through the changing seasons. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every figure moved with purpose and character. Every scene transition flowed naturally into the next, and the overall effect was of watching a complete world come to life through mechanical magic. But when the first story ended and the theatre attempted to transition to the second program, the imperfect gear caused a slight hesitation in the timing. For a moment, Tom thought they had failed, but then the mechanism adjusted, compensating for the irregular gear with the kind of adaptive intelligence that suggested Whitmore had indeed designed his creation to work with human imperfection rather than requiring mechanical perfection. The second story began, then the third, each one more remarkable than the last. By the time they had watched all 12 programs cycle through their performances, both Tom and Ben understood that they had accomplished something extraordinary. Not just completing Thomas Whitmore's mechanical theatre, but proving that his vision had been robust enough to survive both the decades of abandonment and the imperfect efforts of amateur restorers. "We did it," Ben whispered, his voice filled with awe as the theatre returned to its neutral state and settled into patient silence. "We actually finished what he started." Tom felt tears he hadn't expected burning his eyes as he looked at his son, whose face was illuminated by the soft light from the theatre's tiny stage lamps. They had indeed finished what Thomas Whitmore had started. But more than that, they had discovered something about themselves and their capacity to honor commitments made across generations to people they had never met, but somehow understood perfectly. Tomorrow would bring the court hearing and all the complications that came with it. But tonight, in the underground workshop where a master craftsman had once labored with love and loss, Tom and Ben had proven that some promises transcend time and circumstances, and that the right people in the right place can indeed complete what was begun in hope and abandoned in sorrow. The morning of the court hearing arrived grey and drizzling, with the kind of persistent rain that seemed to seep into everything and make the world feel uncertain. Tom and Ben had spent the previous evening making final adjustments to the theatre, ensuring that every story program ran smoothly and that the mechanism could handle the stress of repeated operation. Jennifer Walsh arrived early, carrying a briefcase full of documentation and wearing the expression of a lawyer who believed in her client's case but understood that courts didn't always deliver justice in neat packages. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as they loaded the smaller pieces of the collection into her car for transport to the courthouse. "As ready as we can be," Tom replied, though his stomach was churning with anxiety that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings, and everything to do with the fear that they might lose the right to complete what they had started. The hearing took place in Millbrook's small courthouse, a brick building that had presided over local disputes for over a century. The courtroom was surprisingly crowded. Word of the discovery had attracted not just the legal parties, but also townspeople curious about the outcome, reporters from regional newspapers, and what appeared to be several museum representatives. Taking notes from the gallery, Marcus Webb sat with his attorneys at one table, his expression confident in the way that came from having expensive legal representation and the financial resources to outlast any opposition. At another table sat a woman Tom didn't recognize, who Jennifer explained was representing the Whitmore family descendants who had emerged to claim inheritance rights. Judge Patricia Morrison had been hearing cases in Millbrook for over 20 years. And she approached the proceedings with the practical wisdom of someone who had seen every variety of human conflict played out in her courtroom. She listened patiently as Webb's lead attorney argued that Tom and Ben's restoration work was damaging priceless artifacts and that the collection should be placed in professional conservation until ownership could be properly determined. "Your Honor," the attorney said, in the kind of measured tones that came with charging $400 an hour. "These are irreplaceable historical artifacts that are being subjected to amateur handling by individuals with no training in conservation or restoration. Every day they remain in uncontrolled conditions increases the risk of permanent damage. The Whitmore family attorney took a different approach, arguing that regardless of where the collection was stored or who was working on it, the legal descendants of Thomas Whitmore had clear inheritance rights that superseded any claims based on property ownership or discovered intent. "My clients are not interested in destroying or mishandling these artifacts," she explained. "They simply want to ensure that their ancestors' legacy is properly managed and that any financial benefits flow to his rightful heirs." When Jennifer Walsh stood to present Tom and Ben's position, Tom felt the weight of everything they had discovered and created hanging in the balance. She began not with legal arguments, but with the story itself, the discovery of the collection, the authentication process, and most importantly, the family connection that made Tom and Ben direct descendants with both legal and moral claims to Thomas Whitmore's legacy. "Your Honor, this case is not simply about valuable artifacts discovered by chance," Jennifer argued. "It's about a family legacy deliberately preserved and passed down across generations through the most extraordinary circumstances. Thomas Whitmore didn't just abandon this collection. He carefully hid it on his own property with explicit instructions that it be found and valued by future residents of his former home. She presented the deed, the handwritten note, and the genealogical evidence that established the family connection between Thomas Whitmore and Tom's grandfather. But it was when she described the restoration project itself that Judge Morrison seemed to pay closest attention. "Mr. Mitchell and his son have spent the past 3 months not just preserving these artifacts, but actually completing Thomas Whitmore's unfinished masterpiece using his original plans, tools, and techniques. They have honored his artistic vision while demonstrating exactly the kind of appreciation and understanding that his note suggests he hoped future caretakers would possess." The turning point came when Judge Morrison asked to see the mechanical theater in operation. Court officers carefully carried the device into the courtroom and set it up where everyone could observe its performance. When Ben activated the first story program, the courtroom fell silent as tiny figures began their elaborate dance across multiple stages, telling a story of family love and loss that seemed to speak directly to everyone present. "This is remarkable," Judge Morrison said, as the first program concluded and transitioned smoothly to the second. "Mr. Mitchell, did you and your son really complete this device using 90-year-old plans?" "We did, Your Honor," Tom replied. "We felt we owed it to Thomas Whitmore to finish what he started, especially after we learned he was Ben's great-great-grandfather." The judge watched 2 more story programs before making her decision. "I'm going to deny the injunction," she announced. "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Mitchell and his son have been exemplary custodians of this collection, and their restoration work demonstrates exactly the kind of understanding and appreciation that Thomas Whitmore hoped to inspire." She turned to address the courtroom directly. "However, the question of final ownership remains complex, and I'm ordering all parties to participate in mediation to resolve the inheritance and ownership issues. In the meantime, the collection will remain with Mr. Mitchell, and he is free to continue his restoration work." As they loaded the theater back into Jennifer's car, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced since before Emma's illness. The satisfaction of winning a battle that mattered, of standing up for something beyond immediate survival. But more than that, he felt the deep pleasure that came from completing difficult work alongside someone he loved, and from honoring promises made by people who had trusted in the goodness of strangers they would never meet. "Dad," Ben said as they drove home through the forest that had become their sanctuary, "do you think Mr. Whitmore would be proud of what we did?" Tom looked at his son, whose hands still bore the small cuts and stains that came from working with wood and metal, whose eyes held the satisfaction of someone who had discovered his own capacity to create something beautiful and meaningful. "I think he'd be proud that his great-great-grandson turned out to be the kind of person who understands that some things are worth finishing, regardless of how long they take or how difficult they become," 6 months after the court hearing, Tom stood in the Thomas Whitmore Folk Art Wing of the Millbrook Regional Museum, watching visitors discover the same wonder that had transformed his and Ben's understanding of what it meant to create something lasting. The mediation process had resulted in an outcome that surprised everyone. The Whitmore family descendants had agreed to donate their inheritance claims to the museum in exchange for having the collection displayed in perpetuity with full recognition of Thomas Whitmore's artistic legacy. The museum partnership had provided Tom and Ben with financial security while ensuring that Whitmore's work would remain accessible to the public and, most importantly, functional. Every piece in the collection was demonstrated daily, with visitors able to wind the mechanical bird, watch the train make its circuit through the miniature landscape, and even play chess against Thomas Whitmore's programmed strategies. But it was the mechanical theatre that drew the largest crowds. Multiple times each day, museum visitors gathered around the device as it told its 12 stories, each performance revealing new details that previous viewings had missed. Children were especially drawn to the interactive elements, discovering that they could influence certain aspects of each story through carefully placed controls that Whitmore had designed for exactly that purpose. It's like he knew that every generation would need to make the stories their own, Ben observed, as they watched a group of school children discover that touching certain figures would change their actions within the programmed narratives. Tom nodded, his attention split between the children's excitement and his own work at a smaller table nearby. Over the past months, he had begun creating his own mechanical pieces, learning techniques that combined Whitmore's traditional methods with modern materials and tools. His creations were simpler than his ancestors' masterpieces, but they carried their own meaning, a bridge between past and present, between one generation's vision and another's interpretation. The piece he was working on today would be their contribution to the collection, a mechanical calendar that showed not just dates and seasons, but also phases of the moon, important anniversaries, and space for recording family milestones. Ben had designed the calendar's programming logic, while Tom handled the woodworking and mechanical assembly. Mr. Mitchell, a young woman, approached their work table with the hesitant manner of someone interrupting important work. "I'm Lisa Chen, Sarah's daughter. Mom said you might be willing to answer some questions about the restoration process." Tom looked up to find a teenager, perhaps 16, whose eyes held the same sharp intelligence he had learned to associate with her mother. "Of course. Are you interested in mechanical art?" "I'm interested in the process," Lisa said, settling into a chair beside their work table. "Mum told me about how you and Ben learned to complete Mr. Whitmore's work using his original plans and tools. I'm writing a paper for school about how knowledge gets passed down across generations, and your project seems like a perfect example." As Tom and Ben explained their months-long journey from discovery to completion, Tom realized that this was exactly what Thomas Whitmore had hoped for. His work inspiring new generations to understand and appreciate the connections between craftsmanship and family, and the desire to create something meaningful. The hardest part wasn't learning the technical skills, Ben told Lisa with the authority of experience. It was understanding what Mr. Whitmore was trying to say with each piece. Once we figured out that he was creating conversations rather than just making toys, everything else started to make sense. Later that afternoon, as the museum prepared to close and the last visitors reluctantly left the Whitmore wing, Tom and Ben remained to make final adjustments to their calendar project. The device was nearly complete, requiring only the delicate calibration work that would ensure its timing remained accurate through the changing seasons. "Dad," Ben said as they worked together on the calendar's lunar phase indicator, "I've been thinking about what we'll do next." "Next? After we finish the calendar? I mean, we know how to do this now. How to make wooden gears and springs and mechanisms that tell stories. Maybe we could make more things that are ours, but also connected to what Mr. Whitmore started." Tom paused in his work, struck by the possibility his son was suggesting. Over the past months, he had indeed learned skills he'd never imagined possessing, had discovered a capacity for patience and precision that the desperate urgency of their earlier circumstances had never allowed him to explore. What kind of things were you thinking about? Ben's eyes lit up with the same excitement that had led to every important discovery they'd made together. Well, Mr. Whitmore made a weather device, right? What if we made something that could predict other things, like when the deer will come to the apple grove, or when the best fishing days will be, or when the northern lights might be visible from here? The idea was both ambitious and perfectly logical, extending Thomas Whitmore's integration of mechanical art with practical function into areas that reflected their own interests and understanding of the natural world around their cabin. That would be a way of continuing his work rather than just preserving it, Tom said, warming to the concept. Exactly. And maybe someday other people will find our things and understand what we were trying to say, just like we understood what he was trying to say. As they finished their work for the day and prepared to return to the cabin that had become truly theirs, in ways Tom was still learning to understand, he reflected on how completely their lives had changed since that morning when they'd first discovered the moss-covered container behind the old root cellar. They had financial security now, enough to ensure that Ben could pursue any future he chose without the constraints that had once seemed insurmountable. But more than that, they had discovered a sense of purpose that connected them to their own history while pointing toward possibilities neither had imagined when they'd first moved into the cabin as refugees from circumstances beyond their control. The drive home took them through the forest road that had become as familiar as breathing, past landmarks that now held memories of shared discovery rather than just individual exploration. The cabin itself had been restored and winterized, its rooms now filled with the gentle sounds of mechanical devices going about their patient work, of marking time and telling stories and connecting past to future through the simple magic of gears and springs and carefully shaped wood. That evening, as Ben fell asleep to the familiar lullaby of the mechanical bird on his nightstand, Tom sat in his father's old chair and listened to the rain on the roof while the weather device accurately predicted clearing skies for the morning. Outside, the woods held their secrets with the same patience they had shown for decades, but inside, the cabin was filled with the sounds of ongoing creation. The soft tick of wooden clockwork, the gentle chime of the hourly bird songs, and, underneath it all, the satisfied silence of work completed and promises kept. Thomas Whitmore had indeed found the right family to understand his legacy, and Tom and Ben had discovered that some treasures were worth more than their monetary value. They were worth the time and effort required to complete them properly, worth the patience needed to understand their true meaning, and worth the commitment to pass them on to future generations who might someday continue the conversation between past and present that great art makes possible. As sleep finally came to both father and son, the mechanical devices throughout the cabin continued their patient work, measuring time and weather and the changing phases of the moon, telling their 12 stories to an empty room but ready at any moment to share their magic with anyone wise enough to wind them up and listen to what they had been created to say.